On today's Locked On Jayhawks, we dive into the past times that Kansas has lost 3 consecutive games in a basketball season under Bill Self, how they've bounced back, what's come of it, what it has meant for those specific teams.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm Derek Johnson. You can hear me as well on Rock Chalk Sports Talk, Monday through Friday, 3 to 6 on KLWN in Lawrence. Been losing my voice. I think I'm back on the right track, hopefully, here. But you can hear that later today. And we're free and available here with Locked On Jayhawks anywhere that you get your podcasts or on YouTube. On today's edition of Locked On Jayhawks, we are going to be going over the past times that Kansas has lost 3 consecutive games in the Bill Self era at KU. What kind of came about, how it happened to those teams, how they bounced back, what it meant for those specific teams, to see if we can learn anything from past history for what it could mean for this team. This episode of Locked On Jayhawks is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. So this is the 4th time in the Bill Self era that a KU team has lost 3 in a row. The first time that it happened, you got to go all the way back to the 2004 to 2005 season. That was second year on the job for Bill Self. And, they in 03-04, his first year, they get the 4 seed, they make it all the way to the Elite 8. And then in 04-05, you're feeling great because they're building off that strong run. They look even better. They start 20-1 on the season. They're 10-0 in Big 12 play. And then they lose 3 straight. They lose at Tech in double overtime, 80-79. They lose at home against Iowa State, 63-61. And that was even in overtime. So talk about a low-scoring game. So back-to-back overtime losses. And then they lose at Oklahoma. Oklahoma was the best of those teams that year, 71-63. So 3 straight losses there. Now, in their case, a little different than the 3 straight losses this team had. Yes, you had correlation of one of them being in overtime, but they had 2 in overtime, and they never lost one of them by double digits. This team, obviously, losing one of them by even 6 to Baylor, that would have been, besides the Oklahoma game, the biggest loss that team suffered. And obviously the 20-plus point loss, I think 23 points to TCU, would have been the biggest defeat there. So a little bit different in how those came about, but that team lost those 3 straight. Now, 2012-2013, Kansas was 19-1. So again, a little further on in the season. They were 7-0 in Big 12 play. And then they lost 3 straight against Oklahoma State, 85-80. That was in Allen Fieldhouse. Then at TCU, that was the Topeka YMCA game that everybody remembers. And that, that was not this version of TCU or Jamie Dixon TCU. That was like TCU constant bottom feeder in the Big 12. They lost that one 62-55 on the road. And then they lost at Oklahoma, 72-66. And that went from a team where it was like, okay, this is, you have this great story. Ben McLemore stepping up. Jeff Withey's blocking everything. This is maybe the best team in the country. If not, it's certainly one of the best. And then you lose 3 straight games and boom. Then the last time it happened was the 2020-21 season. Kansas was 10-2. So this one happened earlier in the year. They were just 4-1 in Big 12 play. Although I don't know if date-wise it might have been around the same time, because this was the like post-COVID year, to where the season started a little bit later, like at the beginning of December. So they lose 3 straight at Oklahoma State, 75-70, at Baylor, 77-69. And that was the Baylor team that won the title. And then at Oklahoma, 75-68. And that at the time, that put them at 10-5 and 4-4. I mean, a lot of us remember that season not, going great for KU, especially with how it finished. But I didn't remember they were 4-4 in Big 12 play. That just seems like such a far cry. But hey, if you lose your next game here, if you're Kansas in Big 12 play on Tuesday night against Kansas State, all of a sudden you're 5-4, which is not that different. But each of those previous times, they were able to avoid the 4th straight loss. Now, for Kansas this time, unlike those other three, the chance at losing 4 straight is not a conference game because it happens to line up that it's at Kentucky. But in 2004, 2005, they won the next game. That was after they had lost the 3 straight, drops them to 20-4, 10-3 in conference play. They had that home game against Oklahoma State. That was a really good Oklahoma State team. And you had the crazy game that you still see video of to this day. They win 81-79. That was a big time performance for them to win their or to shake off the 3 straight losses. Then in 2012, 2013, their next game was at home against Kansas State. They won that one 83-62. So they bounced back very well. Then in 2020 to 21 season, they won their next game 59-51 at home against TCU. So they were able to shake it off as well, though they ended up losing the next game. So if that team would have lost that TCU game at home, that team would have wound up with 5 straight losses, which would have been pretty crazy. But it hasn't been since 1989 that this team has lost 4 straight. Think about that. So that's not just a Bill Self stat at this point. This is a Roy Williams stat. Not since 1989 have they lost 4 consecutive games in basketball. And that's what's a real possibility with the schedule at Kentucky on Saturday. Certainly the schedule for this team doesn't help, which, by the way, you hope that it doesn't get as bad as it did in 1989. Kansas lost 8 straight at one point. This team loses 8 straight. Oh my gosh, we're going to be talking about this team being a bubble team. That just doesn't seem right. So let's just cut it off. Let's avoid that. But I think, you look at Bill Self off of losses, just in general, even when it's just one loss, the record is superb. And then there's fewer and fewer times that he's lost 2 straight, or in this case, 3 straight. But I guess 3-0 when he's lost 3 straight. So you hope that streak continues on Saturday as they head into Lexington. Let's get into what it specifically meant, though, for those teams, besides the fact that they were able to kind of shake off the 3-game losing streak. Like, how did those teams finish? When did the stretch happen in the season? Did that relate at all toward the end of the season with March Madness, where they were nosediving or able to bounce back from it? We'll discuss that coming up in our next segment. But first, this episode of Locked On Jayhawks is brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL playoffs are here. We're really excited about our new sports betting partner for Locked On because they're the #1 sports book in America, FanDuel. And if you're new to FanDuel, that's even better. They have so many great features that make betting on sports fun and easy. New customers join today to get started with $150 in free bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Just sign up at FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel has all your favorite bets from the money line to point spreads to player props. Plus, you can even combine your bets for a chance at bigger payouts with same-game parlays. You can bet on Kansas if you think they're going to bounce back from the 3 straight losses against Kentucky. You can bet on the Chiefs. That line keeps bobbing around between Cincy being favored by 2.5. The Chiefs opened as 2.5-point favorites, so you can get it somewhere in there. All on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. So football fans, don't miss out. Place your first $5 bet to get $150 in free bets, win or lose, at FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Okay, getting on to the rest of this segment with what it specifically meant for the KU teams that they lost 3 straight, and figuring out if there's anything we can kind of take away from that. So we'll start with the 2004 to 2005 team. That team would go on to lose in the Big 12 semifinals, and then they lost in the first round of the NCAA tournament to Bucknell. Everybody remembers, with the Wayne Simeon shot nearly finding its way in. Their 3-game losing streak, their kind of bad stretch, it happened so late in the year that it was tough to kind of have all that time in front of you to regain momentum. Like, that's one thing that this team has. There's still plenty of time. Even if they do lose 4 straight to Kentucky, you still have K-State and Iowa State after that. And you still have a full month. Even after the Kansas State game, you still have a full month of February before you even kind of get into some of the bigger months. I don't know. You kind of look at it a little bit different. And that team ended up losing 6 of its final 9 games and 3 of their final 4. at it from that perspective, and it was just kind of tanking toward the end after they had an even better start than this team had. But obviously, if you correlate it and say, well, that team lost 3 straight games, they wound up losing in the first round, right? The 2012 to 2013 season, they'd go on to win 7 straight after the 3 losses in a row. And so they easily bounced back. Then they went on to win the Big 12 tournament. That gave them 10 wins in 11 games headed into the NCAA tournament. There's an exact example of a team that was able to overcome the 3 straight losses and bounce back in more, and really get hot after it. And that's what you'd hope that this team does. And that team ended up getting a 1 seed. They were the number 2 overall 1 seed, made it to the Sweet 16. And then they had that game that they kind of blew against Michigan. So, that's probably the best success story. It was also, when you look at their 3 losses, like the TCU one specifically just feels super fluky with how that happened. And they were all kind of close losses. Then you have the 2020 to 21 season. That team went 2-2 in the next 4 games after they lost 3 in a row. But then they won 5 straight. And they overall had won 8 of 9 games headed into the NCAA tournament. And they were kind of hot. Like, I know it doesn't get remembered well because of how things finished, but that Kansas team from like February to the start of the NCAA tournament had like the number 1 defense in college basketball. Like, they'd changed some stuff up and they'd figured some stuff out, and they became a lot better. They beat Baylor on senior night. And then it's not that they lost in the Big 12 tournament. Like, they won their first game against Oklahoma. They were going to play Texas in the semifinals. Now, Texas had swept them in the regular season, so you don't know for sure if they would have beaten them, but they had to leave because of COVID issues. And some of those COVID issues carried over to the NCAA tournament. Like, you had Jalen Wilson, David McCormick, who were like just back in time and then missed the first round game. And you ended up sneaking by Eastern Washington with the Groves brothers going off. And then you got blown out by USC in the second round, but obviously COVID issues to kind of talk about there. So we total it all up. Look at the past 3 seasons that each of them lost those 3 straight games. You still won the Big 12 in 2 out of those 3 seasons, but you never made an Elite 8 or further. But then again, if we're adding context here, you can make real excuses, or maybe excuses is the wrong word. You can add very fine footnotes or minute details about why, I don't know, like the 2012-2013 team, the fact that they didn't make an Elite 8, it's not because they lost 3 straight games earlier in the season and that the 3 straight losses earlier in the season were an indication of the problems they would have that would leave them out of the Elite 8. No, like, they should have beaten Michigan. And so if that team wins that game and then they're playing, I think they would have been playing like a 3 seed Florida at that point. Who knows? Maybe they win that game. And then at that point, you're playing a 4 seed Syracuse in the Final Four, right? Like, a team could have very easily gone on a deeper run. So I don't know how much we can really take away, just because, and like the 2020-21 season too. Like, I don't know if they beat USC. Probably not. I don't think it matters. Even if guys are healthy back from COVID, if Dave doesn't have the foot injury, they still probably lose to USC. I mean, they lost by so much. It's hard to change it. But here's what could have changed. What if, they don't have the COVID issues and they do play Texas in the Big 12 semifinals and they win that game? And then they beat, I think it was Oklahoma State in the Big 12 title that year. And then they beat Oklahoma State. Now are they all of a sudden on the 2 line? And then they avoid USC altogether, right? Like, things could have easily changed in both of those seasons. And I guess you could say, oh, well, in 2005, if the Wayne Simeon shot drops, who knows if that team gets it going. But it's specifically those 2 years. So on one hand, you can easily correlate it and be like, no self team that has made the Elite 8 or further has lost 3 consecutive games. But also, it is a small sample size. And as I just pointed out, there are small little weird things that happened in a couple of those seasons that could have changed what the path or the future or the destination of those teams were. But I think overall, like, clearly losing this many in a row, which Kansas has with 3 in a row, it's a sign that this isn't a dominant KU or Bill Self team, but I don't know that anybody expected that to be the case. But still, if you thought this was one of the, 4 or 5 best teams in the country, I think this is a sign that maybe that's not really the case. Like, you probably have your first tier of title contenders. KU's not in that right now. Maybe they're in that second tier, but they have to bounce back to even show that at this point. And so you're still good. You still have talent. You still have Bill Self. It's just not one of those absolutely special seasons. And I do think this year, too, the 3-game losing streak is also a little bit different because, in those past seasons, like the loss to TCU for the 12-13 team, the TCU team was really bad. Like this year, you lose to TCU, and it's like, oh, that team could make a Final Four. It's like, yo, you lose to Baylor, they could make a Final Four. Oh, you lose to Kansas State, they could make a Final Four. You know what I mean? Like, the schedule is so much more difficult this year that it would be easier that, honestly, if you look back to some past years and you say, well, this team had a 2-game losing streak, that might be the equivalent to what this team has had this season. But again, any optimistic talk about having a 3-game losing streak and bouncing back from it involves you winning your next game so that you don't continue that losing streak. All right, in just a second, we're going to get on to realistically, what do we expect this team to finish with Locked On Jayhawks? So, Kansas has lost 3 straight. They're sitting at 16-4 on the season, sitting at 5-3 in Big 12 play, which is currently 1 game back of first place. I guess it's tied for 4th because Texas, K-State, Iowa State are occupying the top 3 spots, all tied for 1st. And you're tied with Baylor and TCU. Just absolute madness and a mesh up at the top. But I want to segment this out in 3 different ways. Like, realistically, what do we think this team is going to finish, or what should the expectations be? Let's look at the, I guess, glass half full approach. Realistically, if they figure it out, if they figure out some of their issues, which, there are several, right? There's the lack of bench scoring. There's the lack of some of the freshmen that have, maybe promising futures, but can they figure it out this year, which goes back into the bench stuff. What's going on with DeJuan Harris? Can KJ Adams bounce back from a couple bad performances and being in foul trouble? Can Kevin McCullough figure out his shot? Where's the energy level? Can they stop being down 10 points through the first 8 minutes of the game? Can they do better at defensive rebounding? Can they do well against athletic teams? Like, there are enough flaws here to talk about, and I'm not saying they'd figure out every single one. Like, that's not realistic. But can they figure out the main flaws? Can they figure out the biggest flaws that are kind of haunting them, or at least shore up some of the things and focus on their strengths more, get back to some of the things they were doing better in December, like defending, like forcing turnovers? Can they do some of those things? If they figure it all out, I think realistically, of course, this team could win the Big 12. They could win the Big 12 outright, honestly. I mean, you look at FanDuel right now, they're the betting favorite to still win the Big 12. Now, it's close. I think it's them plus 320. K-State's like plus 350. But the point is, like, everything's still in front of you. You go next week and you beat K-State at home and you win at Iowa State. All of a sudden, and then you beat Texas at home the next night. All of a sudden, you're in first place of the Big 12, right? Now, that's easier said than done because those are very tough opponents, and that would involve quite a run of play that we're not seeing right now from KU. But if they figure it out, everything's in front of them. They can win the Big 12 regular season. They can get a 1 seed. They could get the number 1 overall seed because of how tough this Big 12 is and because of how many quad 1 wins KU already has and would add at that point. So everything's still in front of this team to accomplish everything. Now, if it stays the same, if it stays the exact same of where it is right now, then realistically, you're not going to win the Big 12. If it stays the same of some of the issues you're seeing right now, but you're still overall a pretty talented team and do have a lot of strengths, probably looking at a team that would finish like 10-8 in the Big 12. And if you go 10-8 in this version of the Big 12, maybe 9-9, 11-7, somewhere in that range. I don't know, 11-7, who knows? That might be enough to win it this year. No, probably not. But, if you go 10-8 in the Big 12 this year, and KU racked up a good amount of wins in the non-con, we'll see what happens with Kentucky. I don't know, maybe you're the 4 seed, 3 seed, 5 seed, somewhere in that range in the Big 12 tournament. And if you can grab a couple Big 12 tournament wins, like, wouldn't it be out of the question that you could still get like a 2 seed in the NCAA tournament, just because of how many quad 1 wins and how difficult that would be. So you would still have a lot in front of you, but certainly it would not fit the goals of you trying to win the Big 12, which you're trying every year. And from where you were a couple weeks ago, where it's like, yeah, KU well on a path to a 1 seed, that wouldn't be there. Now, if it gets worse, you get kind of like a snowball effect and things just continue to track down. Is it impossible in this version of the Big 12 that, KU does lose to Kentucky and then they lose to Kansas State and Iowa State and Texas, and now you have 6 or 7 straight losses, and now it's just you're fighting to try to be an NCAA tournament team at that point? I don't know. That doesn't feel super realistic to me, but I guess if it does get worse, if it does snowball, and, now all of a sudden, not only are a lot of your other players struggling, but now Jalen's having tough games too on top of that, and Grady's having tough games at the same time, because as much as they've lost these last games, Jalen's been unbelievable. So now take away that, if that were to go away at any point, what would that mean? And if it does get worse and snowball, then yeah, you're probably looking at this being in the discussion of being one of the worst Bill Self teams of the KU era. I don't think that's going to happen. I look at them and I think they're better than that 2020 to 21 team. They have more firepower, even if it's not all clicking right now. I think they're better than the 18-19 team. Like, I do get the comparisons with, Jalen Wilson, Dedrick Lawson. You're having this unbelievable season. Couldn't figure out enough around him. I think this team is better than that. I think they're more athletic. I think they have higher potential, higher ceiling with their switchability and athleticism to get out and transition than that team did. But, I guess this schedule with the Big 12 is also more difficult, that it could put you in a position where you are a 4 seed. You know what I mean? So I guess if it gets worse and snowballs, then you're in that conversation. If it stays the same, I still think you probably look at a 2 or 3 seed in the NCAA tournament. And if you figure it out, great, even better. But that'll do it for this edition of Locked On Jayhawks. We're going to have our KU Kentucky preview on tomorrow's show. Hopefully my voice will be even better by then, but we'll wait and see on that. Have a good rest of your day. You can find the podcast wherever you find any of your podcasts or on YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe to the show, and you can see me later today on Rock Chalk Sports Talk. Bye.